It being 4 p.m, debate is interrupted for the consideration of the electronic petition signed by 20,000 or more persons listed on the business paper, which is regarding holistic consent sex education lodged by the member for Newtown. As we do have a significant number of people watching online and an outstanding effort in terms of the volume of signatories, I'm just going to explain the process of the debate. So, for the benefit of the public watching online, I just want to take the opportunity to explain the process and rationale behind this unique debate. It is unique because it enables the public to directly bring their concerns to the attention of this House. The intent of this procedure is that the petition debate will start with a speech from a member, in this case the member for Newtown, which is the person who lodged the petition, followed by up to 4 other members, although we have allowed today for additional 2 members to participate in the debate, considering its importance. After all members have spoken, the House will vote on the question that the House take note of the petition. The question will in most cases be determined on the voice and passed. However, if it is challenged by a member, it may proceed to a division. So the question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Newtown.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Greens and on behalf of the 20,986 residents of New South Wales who have raised their voices in support of stronger consent education and better consent laws in our schools and in our society. And I present proudly this petition to the House today. Way back in February, a young woman named Chanel Contos became a household name overnight when she started collecting testimonials from people across the country, shining a light on the assaults, harassment, misogyny, and their experiences every single day in school settings. Pretty soon, these testimonials grew to their thousands. Story after story after story of young women being harassed, raped, shamed and bullied, of young men acting appallingly out of unchallenged feeling that they owned women's bodies, that they were entitled to be able to do whatever they wanted to those bodies. Stories of young women who felt unprepared and ill-equipped to protect themselves or their friends, and desperate at the fact that they felt they didn't need or shouldn't need to have to protect themselves. One thing was made perfectly clear from these testimonies and from the 20,000 people who signed this petition, and that is that young people are not getting the education around sex and consent that they need and they want. We can hear their call loudly. They are saying, "Teach us consent." They want to learn how to behave and recognise behaviour. They want to know what is not okay and where they can go to for help. They want to know how to respond when they experience these assaults or violence towards them. And they want everybody to be taught how to be respectful of each other. This petition calls on us as legislators to act, to ensure that holistic consent sex education is included in school curriculums, and acknowledges that toxic masculinity, rape culture, slut-shaming, victim-blaming, sexual coercion, and an emphasis on community consent, affirmative consent, and offers consent content for all people within our school system and our community. This petition calls for urgent reform also on our sexual consent laws in New South Wales, and it is so wonderful to have seen real progress on that front yesterday with the introduction by the New South Wales Attorney-General of the Sexual Consent Reforms Bill 2021. Much credit and gratitude must go to the powerful leadership of Saxon Mullins for driving this reform. We will have affirmative consent in New South Wales because of Saxon's strength and determination. Earlier today, outside this place, a small group of young women activists draped strings of over 6,000 ribbons, one ribbon for each testimony that was shared with Teach Us Consent and Chanel Contos. There is a reason that this issue has taken centre stage in the media over the last several months. It is because it is something that every single woman understands intimately. If I was to walk out on the street right now and ask the first woman that I saw if she had ever been harassed, assaulted, pressured, slut-shamed, felt uncomfortable in an intimate setting, or not really known what to do when someone ogled her or made some comment about her or touched her in a way that she didn't want, the answer would no doubt be yes. It's happened to me, it's happened to others in this chamber, and if we don't change how we educate our young people, it will happen to our daughters and our granddaughters too. It might feel uncomfortable hearing these stories, but trust me, it is nothing compared to the impact that it has on those who are subjected to sexual assault and sexual violence. Reading through the thousands of testimonies, there are recognisable phrases, and the consequences of failures to address these confront you. We were friends. I was at a party. While I was sleeping, he wouldn't stop. I was scared. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I would never have consented to public sex if I'd been sober. Afterwards, I went to the bathroom and cried. He was a friend. I was trapped, scared. He groped me. I didn't tell anyone. No one knows. I was raped by a boy I knew. I was felled up by someone who was my friend while I slept. I was 12 years old the first time. I was afraid to walk down the corridors at school. The school hasn't taught us enough. We know that teachers are doing as much they can with the best that they can, but I don't think any member in this place can say we are doing enough. When we ask the question, we say, are we doing enough? The answer is overwhelmingly no. I congratulate everybody that has signed this petition calling for consent to be put on the agenda and for us to see reforms so that no young woman, no young person in our society ever faces the kind of violence and assault that we have heard in these testimonies shared here today.
Thank the member for Newtown. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for the North Shore.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Every individual deserves to live their life free from violence and harassment, but women's safety remains a key issue of concern raised across the state, my own community, and across the country. And there are too many stories and too many girls and women who have been assaulted at schools, workplaces, public places, and even in their own homes. And we need to address the issues of why and how women still feel unsafe and are unsafe. And this petition calls for consent to be taught earlier and more holistically in the school curriculum to reduce the extent of sexual assault experiences amongst youth. But it also calls for the curriculum to acknowledge toxic masculinity, rape culture, slut-shaming, victim blaming, sexual coercion and enthusiastic consent, as well as queer sex education. I want to acknowledge the member for Newtown, Jenny Leong, for presenting this petition to the House, and also the member for Coogee, Marjorie O'Neill, for her support of this petition alongside me. And this petition, as we know, follows the Teachers' Consent Initiative of Chanel Contos, and I want to acknowledge everything she's done, and that the movement that she's commenced that has really gone beyond her own initial efforts. And as a former Kambala student, Chanel's initiative is supported by more than 44,000 signatures and over 6,000 testimonies. Now, Chanel wants these voices to be heard, and I want these voices to be heard, and I believe that we as members of Parliament owe it to those who made the effort to make these disclosures of instances of abuse and assault, and to listen to their voices and to deliver on the societal and structural changes that we need and that we deserve. I thank the many brave women and men who came forward to share their experiences. It's a huge step forward in breaking the silence on this insidious form of violence. Now, as a member of the government, I know that the government is committed to improving the prevention and reporting of domestic violence, sexual assault and harassment, and ensuring women's safety. I know the member for Newtown already acknowledged, but this week the Attorney-General and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, Mark Speakman, introduced a bill into this place that we can be very proud of to implement a range of consent reforms. It moves to a communicative model of consent, and it will clarify consent provisions in the Crimes Act 1900 and strengthen laws to provide that consent must be free and voluntary, and it must be an agreement that is communicated between participants to ensure fairer and more effective prosecutions of sexual offences, to address misconceptions about consent in trial proceedings, which horrifically has led to too many individuals not seeing justice, and to improve the victim experience of the justice system. Now, these changes are groundbreaking, and we're a step closer to simplifying our laws and to setting much clearer boundaries for consensual sex and better support for victims. And I congratulate the Attorney-General for his work in bringing forward this reform, and I echo the words of the member for Newtown in acknowledging Saxon Mullen's tireless leadership and her personal contribution to seeing this through. But we also know that schools and parents will play an important role in supporting consent law reform, and I want to recognise that the Minister for Education and Early Childhood Learning is also looking to take action on this and has taken certain steps. And I've spoken with her on a number of occasions about my views on this and the work that we continue to need to do. Earlier this year, we know the Minister released the cross-sector statement of intent, working across schools and across school sectors to try and look at a response to these testimonies that were shared by Chanel Contis in highlighting the prevalence of sexual assault and sexual violence. And it's government, independent Catholic schools all coming together to commit to the sector's strengthening students' understanding of consent and preventing and responding to sexual assault among young people. And there's an entire new package the Minister announced earlier this year as well for New South Wales schools, which has support for teachers and engagement with parents. But this is not just about legislation, it's not just about our education system, it's much more holistic. This is about cultural reform and attitudes and behaviours that flow from that. And it all comes back to listening to what people have to say, because if we don't understand the problem, we don't know the pervasiveness of it, then we don't know the importance and necessity to act. And I wanted to just refer to two of the testimonies from my own community and put their voices on the record. The first is from a person who attended Queenwood School in Mossman, and this person said, "I've had numerous encounters where consent was ambiguous, only to realise years later that I was assaulted after finally receiving sexual education, all too late in year 11. Being visibly too drunk to consent or being penetrated without my knowledge were things I'd both shrugged off at the time. Teaching the importance of nuances of consent at a younger age is vital to the emotional well-being of both boys and girls." The other is a student from Loreto Kirribilli in Kirribilli. "Whilst we had vague conversations about sex and sex education, they were mostly limited to the onus was on the woman to be prepared with contraception when encountering sex. It was too late at this point for us to understand different views when we had traumatic experiences. Consent starts with respect for other human beings and the autonomy of their bodies. We can work together to improve the state's response to this serious issue and to help reduce assaults from occurring."
Thank the member for the North Shore, and I call the member for Coogee.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise today, and I'm a proud co-signatory of this petition. And I think the fact that this petition has cross-party support speaks volumes of the importance of what we are here debating. We are witnessing a powerful movement of people seeking, actually demanding change, particularly when it comes to sexual assault and sexual harassment. And a key part of this movement is about evaluating the role our education system has in teaching sexual consent. And I want to take this moment to thank Chanel Contis and her remarkable advocacy and action that has played a vital role in this petition that we are debating here today. I also want to thank all those who are brave enough to share their testimonies, from women in particular who've been sexually assaulted, many of whom at the time were unable to identify that they'd been assaulted at all. A review of the way in which we teach consent has been in dire need for generations. Important conversations on this topic have been had in our communities for years, and finally today we bring this discussion to this Parliament. Young people in particular are screaming out for change. They're demanding a curriculum that is inclusive of diverse genders and sexualities, that provides an in-depth analysis of safe and respectful relationships and makes clear how essential the role of consent is in ensuring equality. We know that school-age children are struggling to understand and appropriate respectful norms of sexual behaviour. We also know that without addressing this, those young people become adults that struggle to understand and establish appropriate and respectful relationships. Schools play a pivotal role in helping to lift the level of understanding young people have of consent, and in doing so can help shift the way our future generations think and act. To achieve this, we need a formal approach to consent education. What we stand to gain from informed, holistic and professional delivery of consent education and sex education is immeasurable progress. We can begin to directly address the harrowing rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment in our community. We stand to gain a deeper understanding of how such abuse is always correlated with an unequal distribution of power between people. In order to do this, we need the curriculum to be developed and delivered by experts who have made this their profession. We must not let the success be evaluated by the wrong metrics. The measure of success cannot simply be how many students attended a session or downloaded materials. It must be evaluated on depth of understanding and a reduction in sexual harassment and sexual assault. Madam Speaker, I have deep concerns of the current proposal put forward by the government, in particular the metrics being used and placing the burden of consent education onto our already overworked and underpaid teachers. It should be delivered by specialist experts. Madam Speaker, our education system must not be the only place our children and young people learn the concepts of consent and respect and how to differentiate between what is acceptable and what is not. We all play a role, and we can all help our young people take what they've learnt in a classroom and practice it in real-life behaviours, because we know that sexual assault, sexual harassment and discrimination towards women is born from the inequality that we see each and every day. Such inequality that thrives in our workplaces, in our sporting fields, outside our classrooms. It is this inequality that allows the conditions in which sexual harassment and abuse occur. A normalised subservience of women in our society is evident everywhere we look. In our pay inequality, in the glass ceiling promotions, in the lack of financial recognition for the unpaid care and responsibilities that keep our economy going. This all must be addressed. Madam Speaker, I echo the member's words, and I really welcome the legislation yesterday by the Attorney-General that looks to strengthen the laws in New South Wales in relation to sexual consent reform. This is an important piece of legislation, but we cannot stop there. It is a breakthrough and wonderful that we are in this Parliament today finally having this conversation. But there is so much more work that needs to be done. We owe it. We absolutely owe it to the next generation to get on with the job and to fix all of these problems that are systemically underlying and driving this inequality, which drives rape and discrimination.
Thank the member for Coogee. The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Balmain.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the message of this petition is clear. Women and girls in New South Wales are subjected to sexual assault and harassment at alarming levels. And the 20,986 signatories to this petition understand that one of the key drivers to this situation is that young people simply are not being provided with adequate education about sex and consent. Consent is not simply hearing a no, Madam Speaker. Consent means having the permission of an engaged and enthusiastic partner. It can be revoked at any point. And just because someone consented to sex or a sexual act in the past, it doesn't mean that it's okay next time. Consent also needs to be understood in the context of our culture. It has to include an understanding of enthusiastic consent, of what toxic masculinity is, rape culture, slut-shaming, victim-blaming, sexual coercion and queer sex. Teaching consent and sex education doesn't mean teaching biology. It means young people, in particular, need to have the education so they can understand that sexual assault isn't about someone jumping out of a dark alley and forcing themselves on you. It can be, and it is often more subtle, more insidious and more gradual. Yesterday in the House, the Attorney-General went into detail about the government's plan to reform consent laws in New South Wales, and the Attorney went into great detail about the continuum of consent and used detailed examples to show how consent should work in practice. These are complicated and sensitive conversations to have, which is why this petition has rightly called on consent and sex education to be conducted by experts. Each of the 6,000 people who contributed their testimonies to the Teachers' Consent website wants to change this. Every one of the 20,986 who signed this petition want to change this. The experts, the advocates, the community groups, including Domestic Violence New South Wales, Women's Safety New South Wales, Rape and Domestic Violence Advocacy Service, Get Up, Foundation for Young Australians, people like Yumi Steins, Clementine Ford and Mamma Mia, they all want change. I want change, Madam Speaker, and this House should demand change. If the government wants to take steps to end sexual violence, they have to start by ensuring the delivery of mandatory sex education, which is early, which is clear, which is direct, comprehensive and taught by experts. I want to thank all the members in this House with goodwill who have approached this issue. I of course want to thank my colleague, Greens member for Newtown, Jenny Leong, her staff for their work in this effort, and also the members of the other place, including Abigail Boyd, my colleague and MLC. I also of course want to acknowledge and thank Chantal Contos, Danny Villafana and the team at Youth Against Sexual Violence, and Jamie Evans from the Women's March. Madam Speaker, this is an issue whose time has come. It's an issue where the Attorney-General is putting forward legislation that this House needs to review with the community, with those 20,000 people who've signed this petition, to make sure that this is the most robust, the most forward-looking and the most effective legislation, not just here in Australia but around the world. And if we take that step, Madam Speaker, we'll be proud to be legislators, proud to be those people who have delivered that to the next generation. We owe it to survivors, Madam Speaker, to listen to them and to deliver change, and I urge all members of this House to support the petition.
I thank the member for Balmain. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Holsworthy, who is joining us virtually.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on this important topic and would like to endorse the thoughtful comments and contribution of those who have been involved or spoken on this petition debate. But I'd like to particularly acknowledge my colleague, the member for North Shore, who takes every opportunity she can to raise this topic to support women and their safety. In addition to highlighting the importance of consent education in schools, the petition also calls for urgent reform to require sexual consent to be what the petition calls enthusiastic consent. Madam Deputy Speaker, the New South Wales Government has committed to reforms to simplify and strengthen the law around sexual consent. As a Member of Parliament, I am so pleased and humbled to be able to help future generations to not face what so many of us have been through previously. Madam Deputy Speaker, in May 2018, the New South Wales Attorney-General asked the New South Wales Law Reform Commission to review sexual consent laws and report on whether the laws needed to be amended, simplified or modernised, having regard to all relevant issues, including the experience of victim survivors in the criminal justice system. The Commission consulted widely over 2.5 years and received extensive feedback, including almost 200 written submissions and more than 3,850 survey responses. The Commission's report 148, Consent in Relation to Sexual Offences, was tabled in Parliament on the 18th of November 2020. On the 25th of May 2021, the New South Wales Attorney-General and Minister for Prevention of Domestic and Sexual Violence announced the Government's response to the Commission's report and reforms to simplify and strengthen consent laws, together with Survivor Advocate and Director from Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy, Thaxton Mullins, the New South Wales Police Commissioner, Mick Fuller, Minister for Education, Sarah Mitchell, and Minister for Women, Bronnie Taylor. Madam Deputy Speaker, currently it's a crime for a person to have sexual intercourse with another person without their consent if the person knows that the other person does not consent. An accused knows the other person does not consent if they have actual knowledge, are reckless, or have no reasonable grounds for believing the other person consents. Under the Government's reforms, a person does not consent to sexual activity unless they said or did something to communicate consent. An accused's belief that consent existed won't be reasonable in the circumstances unless they said or did something to ascertain consent. Importantly, the reforms were introduced this week by the Attorney-General and Minister for Prevention of Domestic and Sexual Violence to help simplify and modernise our state's consent laws, focusing on holding perpetrators to account while also changing social behaviour. These changes will be accompanied by extensive community education, so we all know what is appropriate and what is not okay. Madam Deputy Speaker, the New South Wales Government supports in principle all 44 recommendations made by the Law Reform Commission in its report and plans to go further in one key respect. These reforms will reinforce that consent is a free choice involving ongoing and mutual communication. Consent should not be presumed. In addition, the reforms will include 5 new jury directions to help juries better understand sexual assault survivors' experiences and to address some common misconceptions about consent. These directions will support complainants by ensuring their evidence will be assessed fairly and impartially, and that juries will be able to better understand the experiences of sexual assault survivors. These directions include non-consensual sexual activity can occur in many different circumstances and between different kinds of people, including people who may know each other, or people who are married to one another, or people who are in an established relationship with one another. Responses to non-consensual sexual activity, including that there is no normal response, that people may respond in different ways, including by freezing, and the jury must avoid making assessments based on preconceived ideas about how people respond to non-consensual sexual activity. People who do not consent to sexual activity may not be physically injured or subjected to violence or threatened with physical injury or violence, and the absence of any evidence of this does not necessarily mean that a person is not telling the truth about alleged sexual offence. Responses to people may have to giving evidence, including that trauma may affect people differently, and that the presence or absence of emotion or distress does not necessarily mean that a person is not telling the truth about an alleged sexual offence. It should not be assumed that a person consented because their behaviour, including because they wore particular clothing, consumed drugs or alcohol, or were present at a particular location. Madam Deputy Speaker, a research project will also be established to improve our understanding of the experience of complainants of sexual offences within the criminal system, and I know my time is running out, so I would like to finish by thanking each and every one of the signatories on this petition as they help to provide an avenue to allow us to highlight and make changes to this significant topic, and thank you for those few extra seconds.
That's fine. Thank you to the member for Holsworthy. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Granville.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise today as the Shadow Minister for Youth and as a victim survivor of sexual assault. And at the outset, I want to thank Chanel Contos for her incredible bravery and strong advocacy in highlighting the dire need for better consent education and reforms to the Crimes Act through this petition, and for creating a platform for thousands of her peers to talk about their awful experiences of sexual assault, harassment, victim blaming and slut shaming. I also want to thank the members for Coogee, Newtown and North Sydney for sponsoring the petition before us today. After reading about Chanel's experiences, I made contact with her as it was so similar to my own experience of sexual assault 28 years ago, which I spoke about to the Sydney Morning Herald earlier this year. Similar in the attitudes and backgrounds of the men who raped each of us. Both of them came from quite privileged backgrounds, attended single-sex schools and didn't have a lot of contact with girls, and both of us had mistakenly thought that they were our friends. It turns out Chanel's father's office is just around the corner from mine, and he is so proud of his strong and articulate daughter and the voice she has given to so many. He's a really lovely man, and he's incredibly proud of her, as he should be. It's incredibly disappointing to me that a generation on after I was raped, the same problems remain and the same excuses are used. There's an enormous need for better consent education. The rigour can't just be measured in required hours in the PDHPE syllabus. It needs to be measured in outcomes, and it needs to be delivered by experts. The testimonials made to Chanel's platform from thousands of young people who are victims of such a traumatic crime suggest that an overhaul is necessary. This is about the safety and well-being of young people, and it's incredibly important, and it needs to start earlier. Boys and girls need to know what respectful relationships look like, and that sex is supposed to be a mutually enjoyable experience entered into willingly by both partners. If it isn't, if there isn't consent, then it's a crime, and it can be incredibly traumatic, causing years, even decades of distress. Too many young lives, especially young women's lives, have been destroyed by being sexually assaulted. There's no just getting a bit carried away. It's important that girls, and it's usually girls who are victims, know their rights, but also that boys know the consequences of their actions. They need to know that there are no mixed messages. There's absolutely nothing that can convey consent other than enthusiasm. No outfits, no prior behaviour, nothing. The language of the testimonials reflects the problems that exist around education, the confusion that so many experience after being assaulted, that it's only later when they've been through education, that they realise what happened to them was actually a crime, and there are reasons why they were so distraught by the experience. Also, the slut shaming and victim blaming, that can start a lot younger than we anticipate. And we really need to make sure that this doesn't happen to children. I thank the Attorney-General for proposing long overdue amendments to the Crimes Act to move to an affirmative consent model to seek to remove the defence that a rapist thought their victim had consented. And I am hopeful that this will assist in the prosecution of this most horrible crime, and we will begin this debate shortly. But reform has taken far too long. It's almost a generation on from when I appeared in court as a victim of sexual assault, and that wasn't that long after unsworn statements from the doc were banned. Not much has happened in the meantime, but we do need to change things. We do need to make sure juries understand the circumstances that victims find themselves in. But prevention is just as important, if not more so. Sexual assault is an incredibly prevalent crime, which around 20% of women experience at some point, most commonly between the ages of 15 and 25. It's also rarely reported. We can do more to prevent it, and education is key. I want to thank Chanel for her bravery, and women like her, Saxon Mullins, Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, have all been an inspiration to so many of us. Tens of thousands of Australians, women and men, marched this year in support of ending sexual violence and gendered violence. Enough is enough. Reform is long overdue.
I thank the member for Granville. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Charlestown, who's joining us virtually.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm very pleased to speak in this debate as well, because for so long the pervasive problem of sexual violence has been allowed to fester in the shadows. I'm pleased as the Shadow Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault to speak in support of this petition, calling for a number of things, but in particular holistic consent, inclusive sex education in the school curriculum, and for reform in the way the law approaches consent. Madam Deputy Speaker, disgusting behaviour has often been waved off with statements like, boys will be boys. Victim survivors have far too often been ignored, degraded and re-traumatised by those who in theory should have supported them through what may well have been the darkest times of their lives, while perpetrators have often been left free to move on to the next victim. The Boxar figures speak for themselves. In the 2 years from July 2019 to June 2021, the rate of sexual assault reported to police in New South Wales went up 21%, but still justice remains difficult to secure for far too many victim survivors. There's an estimated 200,000 sexual assaults in Australia each year. Only 13% report to police, about 5% make it to trial, and just 2% result in a conviction. There can be no avoiding that we as a society face a reckoning on the issue of sexual violence. And it's thanks to brave individuals like Saxon Mullins, Brittany Higgins and Chanel Contos that we're having a long overdue public discussion about rape and consent. Saxon Mullins went public about her horrific personal experience and said, all you need to say is, do you want to be here? And very clearly, do you want to have sex with me? And if it's not an enthusiastic yes, then it's not enough. Supporting this petition being debated today, the Teachers Consent website contains thousands of harrowing stories and experiences and disclosures of young people who want to see reform in both law in relation to sexual consent and sex education and consent in schools before senior years. These experiences may be recent or they might be decades old, but they all contain the same consistent themes. That there was no consent given for the sexual act which occurred, and the result of that lack of consent has been felt by the victim on an ongoing basis, sometimes for years and sometimes for a lifetime. The person who was not given consent was more often than not a trusted person, and sometimes the person retelling their experience at the time of the assault, and perhaps right up until sharing their experience as part of their campaign, they didn't even know that what occurred to them was rape. There was no consent given. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have to do better. It's clear that if consent isn't clearly given, then sexual activity cannot and must not happen. Sex without consent is rape, and rape is not okay. Speaker, I note yesterday the government introduced the Crimes Legislation Amendment Sexual Consent Reforms Bill, and I'll certainly have more to say on that bill during the second reading debate. It's worth noting now, though, that the Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia CEO Hayley Foster has stated that the legislation requires that people will need to ensure that active steps have been taken to establish whether a person wants to have sex before engaging in the act. And this petition calls for legislation to do that. The issue of consent education in our schools is a key part of this petition as well, and I note that a statement of intent has been signed by the Department of Education, the independent schools and Catholic schools, and I truly hope, though, that the statement of intent goes beyond intention and into action. It's through frank, inclusive discussion of consent and respect throughout school years that change will occur. And I want to recognise the great work of NAPCAN, their Love Bites program, which receives very little government funding but is present in many schools already. And I'd like to recognise that Chanel Contos, who led this petition, has been in contact with NAPCAN about Love Bites after the introduction from the former Shadow Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, the member for Blue Mountains. Madam Speaker, the thousands of real experience on the teacher's consent site simply cannot continue to occur. We must not allow lives to continue to be damaged for months, years, and sometimes lifetimes. I want to thank all the women and, yes, the men who've come forward to share their stories and drive this important and long overdue discussion. I join with the signatories of this petition in saying it is beyond time. Let's get it done.
Thank the member. Charles Dunn. The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the Minister for Schools and Tertiary Education in response.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, can I firstly acknowledge the more than 6,000 victim survivors of sexual violence and assault that shared their testimony and are very personal stories. And can I also acknowledge my colleagues here today that have also spoken so eloquently about the difficulties about speaking up and the way society treats victims and sexual assault and the way we behave. But most importantly, can I thank Jenny Leong, member for Newtown, and bringing this important petition to the House for debate today. Today I am speaking in my capacity as a Minister in the Lower House representing the Minister for Education in the Upper House. Madam Speaker, the New South Wales Government acknowledges how important it is that all students, and indeed all members of the community, receive appropriate and timely education about consent and respectful relationships. Sexual assault is one of the most heinous crimes to confront our community and the justice system. Sexual offences are significantly underreported to police. Where charges are laid and the matters do proceed to court, attrition rates are high and conviction rates are comparatively low. Recent figures by the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research show a 61% increase in sexual assault incidents reported to New South Wales Police in March this year, compared with a monthly average over the previous year. This spike coincided with a substantial media coverage earlier this year, which sparked a long overdue public conversation about sexual violence in the community. There are many reasons why victim survivors of sexual assault may choose not to report. When they do report, it is critical that they are supported throughout the process. The New South Wales Government had heard the voices of victim survivors loud and clear. The initiatives outlined by my colleagues illustrate some of the changes underway in our education and justice system in response. The Department of Education also offers the Life Ready program, which is a mandatory 25-hour course for all our Year 11 and 12 students in New South Wales public schools. The course builds upon the respectful relationships education that is included in the mandatory kindergarten to Year 10 PDHP syllabus. The Life Ready course prepares senior students to lead healthy, safe and meaningful lives and to develop respectful, safe and healthy relationships. The New South Wales Government has developed professional learning programs and resources to support the teaching of the PDHP syllabus and the Life Ready course. These resources help students develop skills in recognising and responding to unsafe situations, effectively seek assistance and develop the knowledge and skills of protective strategies appropriate to their age and stage of learning. Subsequent to the implementation of the new syllabus, there has been wide public discussion around consent and sexual assault experienced by young people. These reports have further raised awareness of this major societal issue that require a further response. As mentioned, the cross-sectoral statement of intent acknowledges the crucial role of our schools in supporting and protecting the safety of children and young people. The statement of intent identifies key areas where the education system and schools can lead meaningful change, including increased support for teachers and school leaders and curriculum provision. This will ensure that the views of students are heard and strengthen community and parent connections. The New South Wales Government has introduced a bill to Parliament that implements these reforms. This is not just about holding perpetrators to account, but changing society's behaviour. Ultimately, these are matters of respect and everybody deserves to be safe.
Can I thank the Minister? The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Newtown in reply.
Thank you, Speaker. We were going to have the galleries packed. We had planned the thousands of people that would be chanting right now on Martin Place to replicate the incredible presence of tens of thousands of women marching to say enough is enough on the 15th of March this year. I acknowledge Caitlin Burkett, who worked in our office and organised and started planning that mass action that was going to occur that unfortunately did not eventuate. Instead, I'm sure that there are a few people watching online. Thank you, Chanel, for checking in. And hopefully we will be able to see this shared in many, many ways. But the power of the voices that came into this chamber today in this debate is strong. The fact that we have seen momentum grow from the Me Too movement to the Enough is Enough marches at the beginning of this year, to delivering real reform here this week in this chamber with the sexual consent reforms that we will see delivering affirmative consent in New South Wales demonstrates that this movement is not going anywhere. And we will not stop until the harassment stops, the violence stops, the bullying stops, the outrageous toxic masculinity stops. We will not stop. So can I acknowledge everybody that contributed to this petition debate? Can I acknowledge Felicity Wilson, Marjorie O'Neill, Jamie Parker, Melanie Gibbons, Julia Finn, Jodie Harrison and Jeff Lee? Can I acknowledge the instigator of this petition, Chanel Contos? We did it, Chanel. And acknowledge Felicity and Marjorie for co-sponsoring and standing with this petition when it was set up. In addition to that, I would like to acknowledge and thank the amazing young women, and I'm going to just take leave to continue talking for a little like the Minister did, acknowledge the amazing young women that stood out the front today and tied 6,000 ribbons onto rope. Lucinda Hoffman, Chloe Corbell, Daniel Villafana, Harriet Ryder, and acknowledge my fellow MPs that joined us out the front, Abigail Boyd, Julia Finn, Marjorie O'Neill, Jenny Aitchison, Leslie Williams, Jo Halen and Felicity Wilson. I would like to also thank the organisations that my colleague Jamie Parker ran through previously for sharing the petition, because it's not easy to get to 20,000. And I want to end by saying that the weight of responsibility that we have to do something about the 6,000 plus testimonies that were shared is huge. And we as legislators in this place have a responsibility to make sure that this does not pass here, that this continues until we see an end to sexual violence and sexual assault across our society, in New South Wales, in our school system, and across the globe. Thank you, Speaker.
Can I thank the member for Newtown? And before I put the question, can I just also commend the signatories, the 20,986. Can I also thank my colleagues on both sides of the House that have expressed, I know, the shared views of so many other members who were unable to participate in the debate today, including myself. Thank you. I will now put the question that the House take note of this petition. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. And thank you to those online for your ayes. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The debate on the 20,000 plus signature electronic petition on holistic